Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. There is a special kind of horror in surviving a battle against the Orks. It is not honor, it is not mercy, it is not even survival in the true sense. When the green tide sweeps through, leaving broken bodies and burning worlds in its wake, the only fate worse than dying beneath its boots is living as its captive. There are no treaties, no Geneva Conventions, no prison camps with rules and rations. To be taken by the Orks is to be reduced, not simply as a prisoner, but as an object of endless cruelty and sick amusement, living at the whim of creatures who understand neither pity nor limits. Death, in such a moment, would have been a gift. Those few unfortunates who have returned from Orkish captivity do not come back whole. They do not tell tales in words, but in stares that never blink, in fingers that twitch as if still feeling the prod of a grot's whip, in the screaming fits that wake them every night. They are the broken remnants of a life long since shattered, their minds forever branded with the sounds of stomping boots, rusted saws, and laughter that echoes like thunder. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates worse than death. This is one of them. To be captured by Orks is to be chosen for a purpose so alien, so brutally arbitrary, that it defies any sense of logic known to humanity. Orks do not take prisoners out of kindness, nor for any conventional military objective. They do it for one of two reasons: because it amuses them, or because it serves some grotesque function in the churn of their endless walk. That is the unifying principle of Orkish captivity: utility or entertainment, and often both at once. To be spared in battle is not a sign of luck. It means you've been selected to serve in some other, far worse capacity. For many, capture begins in the swirling chaos of war. Perhaps your unit was overrun and you were buried under corpses, left unnoticed until the grots poked through the dead. Maybe you were shot, but not quite fatally, and lay twitching in the mud as Orks combed the battlefield for survivors to collect like toys. Some are even taken mid-battle, hoisted up on the backs of bellowing knobs like trophies. Whatever the moment, the decision to spare a human life is not calculated. It's impulsive. It's a whim. You are no longer a soldier. You are a thing, a curious object to the Ork who seized you. What makes it worse is that there is no single reason Orks take prisoners. Some war bosses like to keep humans around as status symbols, a kind of living decoration for their camps. Others use them as bait, tying them to poles outside their bases and laughing at the distress of any nearby PDF or Astartes who dares to look. Mech boys snatch captives to serve as living templates or spare parts. Pain boys take them for darker pleasures still. And then there are the fights, the crude, roaring pits where humans are thrown in to entertain a crowd of jeering greenskins with the futile thrashings of survival. The Orks have no use for diplomacy. They don't negotiate ransoms, don't trade hostages, and don't release prisoners for good behavior. To them, a human is like a squig, amusing to poke, fun to torture, sometimes useful, often disposable. In the rare case an Ork decides a human might be useful for longer, it's usually for the most debased tasks imaginable. They might be made to clean the filth-caked armor of a knob using their own shirt and spit. They might be chained to machines and forced to pump levers endlessly, unaware what the mechanism even does. Or worse, forced to participate in the Orks' mockery of warfare, clad in rags and set running before a charge just to see how long they last. There are whispered rumors, even among hardened inquisitors, of certain Ork warbands who believe keeping prisoners brings good luck. Some madboys claim that the shrieks of a captured human are pleasing to Gork and Mork. Others keep them simply to punch when they feel bored. There's even a tale, horrifying in its implications, of a war boss who kept a librarian prisoner and would sit and grunt at him for hours, as if demanding parables or stories, like some monstrous parody of a student. But perhaps the most horrifying truth is this: to an Ork, taking a prisoner is no different than picking up a shiny rock. You are not a being, you are a novelty. If you scream, that's amusing. If you resist, even better. And if you break, if you finally collapse and curl up and beg for death, that is the ultimate prize. That is when they know they've won, not the war, but the game. This is why to be taken, not killed, by Orks is a fate steeped in cruelty. Death is clean. Death is simple. Capture means becoming the living subject of a sadistic theater where you do not know the rules, cannot understand the audience, and where every act, every moment is driven by the primal joy of a species that knows only war, noise, and dominance. It is the beginning of a descent, not into a cell, but into madness. There is no preparation, no training, no nightmare vivid enough to convey the first hours of captivity under the Orks. For those taken alive, reality becomes a chaos of color, pain, and sound. Too loud to think, too fast to comprehend. It begins in the dirt, often literally, dragged or thrown into crude pits, surrounded by rusting metal, blood-slicked floors, and the stench of thousands of unwashed bodies. The Orks do not segregate prisoners from filth, from beasts, or even from battle. To be captured is to be deposited like garbage, dumped into a world without rules or reason, and forced to survive by sheer will and dumb instinct. The air inside an Ork encampment is thick with oil smoke, cordite, and the putrid scent of squigs rotting in cages. Everything is moving, stomping, clanging. Grots scurry with cruel little faces and sharper blades. Orks thunder past, paying no heed to the small broken thing now screaming in their shadow. Shouting is constant. Arguments over nothing, laughter over violence, and the guttural barks of war bosses cracking across the air like artillery. The prisoner, barely conscious, might hear music, if you can call it that, a cacophony of drums beaten on metal and the howling of warped speakers that blare chants to Gork and Mork. It is noise weaponized, not to rally, but to disorient and subjugate. The pain starts early. If you can still move, they'll make sure you can't. A swift kick, a punch, a prod from a crude shock stick. They want to see you crawl, want to hear you grunt. Not out of cruelty in the human sense, but curiosity, amusement. You are not being broken for information. You are being tested, like a squig in a cage, to see what noises it makes when you press the right parts. Clothing is stripped. Sometimes armor is yanked away while the body is still inside it. Belongings, memories, even dog tags, all gone. In the Ork's eyes, you're already part of the landscape, no more distinct than the rocks and scrap. Sometimes they tattoo you crudely with ash and engine grease. Sometimes they paint you, literally daub you in their clan colors as a joke. Others are branded, or forced to wear signs hung around their necks with Orkish glyphs mocking their former identity. Umi Squig, Funny Boy, or Noisy Git. And then, always, comes the pit. It is not a prison in the conventional sense. There are no cells, no bars. The pit might be a crater, a sunken cargo bay, the hull of a wrecked imperial ship. It is filled with other prisoners, some too broken to speak, others driven half-mad already. There is no food schedule, no sanitation. Filth piles in corners and water leaks from rusted pipes that reek of machine oil. You learn quickly that standing too close to the edges invites the grots to play their favorite game, throwing rocks, or worse, bottles full of something steaming. For many, the first instinct is to organize, to seek structure. But this too is mocked. The Orks sometimes throw food in, just enough for one or two to see what the humans will do, and they watch. Always watching, sometimes laughing, sometimes taking bets. There is no privacy. Every act, even weeping, is observed. Every act of kindness is punished, not by the Orks, but by the desperate others in the pit, who have already learned that kindness marks you as weak. Some speak of hallucinations in these early hours, visions brought on by concussion, dehydration, or the warp bleeding through the tortured minds around them. Whispers of faces melting into Ork grins, of eyes glowing in the dark, a sense that something watches beyond even the greenskins. Perhaps it is madness. Perhaps something else. But all agree, there is no clarity. The brain cannot process what is happening, and that confusion is a tool as much as the chains. What makes the Orks' treatment of prisoners so uniquely horrifying is the unpredictability. One moment, you're ignored. The next, you're hoisted up for sport. Some are taken away for fun, never to return. Others vanish, then return days later stitched together, their limbs replaced with crude mechanical arms or tubes, wheezing and staring without comprehension. And the rest, the ones who remain, learn not to look, not to think, not to feel. You are not awaiting trial. You are not serving time. You are enduring an indefinite sentence in a parody of reality, where the laws are made by madmen who laugh while they beat you and then forget why they did it. Time stretches. Seconds become hours. Hours become a blur. And somewhere in that stretch of horror, you begin to forget what it was like to live as anything other than prey. There are few things more degrading in the galaxy than being put to work by the Orks. Not commanded, not conscripted. Worked like a beast, like a cog, like something beneath even their contempt. For those captives not chosen for sport or torture, this is the fate that awaits. Endless labor under the cracked boots of the greenskins, chained to the grindstone of a war machine that never stops, never sleeps, never cares. This is the Grot's chain. Not a literal chain, though that may be part of it, but a cycle of servitude so complete, so consuming, that the prisoner ceases to remember a time when they were not simply a tool. The Orks, for all their brutishness, are builders of chaos. Their war camps are sprawling cities of scrap and rust, constantly shifting, expanding, collapsing, and rebuilding. It takes manpower to keep such madness functioning, and while Grots serve in vast numbers, Orks have little concern for their own labor efficiency. So they add humans into the mix, not for help, but to amuse themselves with how much suffering they can extract from something fragile and civilized. Captured humans are slotted into the most degrading, exhausting, and soul-killing roles imaginable. You might spend days hauling ammunition that weighs more than your own body, forced to drag it across broken terrain, while Grots jab you with sticks and laugh if you collapse. Others are made to clean, not with tools, but with their hands and shirts and tongues if the Orks feel particularly cruel. You're forced to scrub the oil-caked feet of knobs, to scoop out the squig pens, to polish the rusted teeth of a deaf dread with spit and rags until it gleams just enough to satisfy a mech's half-demented standards. The irony is that the Orks don't need this labor. They just find it funny. There's no economy here, no productivity goals. They'll often destroy what you've built just to watch you start over. Mech boys might assign prisoners to carry impossible weights or spin gears that don't connect to anything, cackling at the futility. A human prisoner could spend a week digging trenches, only to have an Ork stompa march right over them the next day. If you complain, if you even slow down, you're whipped, kicked, or thrown into the pit for rest, which in Orkish parlance might mean being sat on by a bored knob until your ribs cave in. Food, if it's given at all, is rotten squig meat or nutrient paste scavenged from whatever shipwreck or imperial site the Orks recently looted. Water comes from rusted canisters or puddles near the mech pits, often laced with oil, engine coolant, or worse. Sanitation is a myth, disease is rampant, and the Orks view it as a bonus. Watching prisoners deteriorate adds another layer of entertainment to their daily routine. Some even make bets on how long a sick human will last. There's no medicine, only pain boys, and what they offer is not healing, but experimentation. Sleep is a privilege rarely granted. You are worked until your body fails, then kicked awake to start again. Some captives fall unconscious mid-task and never wake up, their bodies left to rot or dismembered by Grots who find new uses for them. The smell of decay is constant. So is the fear, not of execution, but of monotony, of never-ending motion, of becoming one of the shambling, glassy-eyed wrecks who have forgotten everything but the task at hand. And then there's the laughter. The Orks never stop laughing. Not in joy, but in mockery. Every stumble, every injury, every gasp of breath elicits howls of amusement. You are not a slave. You are a joke. A walking, bleeding, crying punchline to a cosmic gag told by a race that finds comedy in entropy. Worse still are the days when the Orks are bored. Those are the days when they invent new tasks just to see what happens. Stack these crates, now knock them over. Dig this hole, now fill it in. Carry this squig, now chase it. Paint this wall, now repaint it in a different color. There is no logic, only suffering as performance art. Grots cheer, Orks jeer, and the prisoner learns that there is no victory, no reprieve, only an eternal cycle of sweat and mockery. Some prisoners begin to lose themselves. They stop speaking. They nod when shouted at. They forget their names. They become part of the background, moving when prodded, working when ordered, no longer caring if what they do matters. These are the ones the Orks like most, the broken tools, the quiet ones who scream only in their sleep. This is the Grot's chain. A life not of shackles but of humiliation so profound, so repetitive, that it becomes identity. Not a prisoner, not a soldier, not a human, just another piece of the machine. There's a particular brand of cruelty in what Orks call entertainment. Among the most horrifying fates that can befall a prisoner is to be chosen as a participant in one of the many arenas built across the roiling chaos of a greenskin war camp. These are not places of justice or even spectacle in any civilized sense. They are open-air coliseums of scrap metal and screaming mobs, where life is measured not in heroism or skill, but in how funny your death is. To fight in these pits is to become the living center of an orcish joke, played out for the gods Gork and Mork, or so the orcs believe, howling with delight at every shattered bone and torn limb. The arenas vary wildly, depending on the whims of the war boss or mech in charge. Some are crude circles of rusted sheet metal and scavenged girders. Others are vast stadiums built into the skeletons of dead titans, echoing with the roar of tens of thousands of orcs and grots. There is no standard layout, no set rules. One might find jagged spikes rising from the floor, buzzsaws spinning at random intervals, squigs chained to walls waiting to pounce, or even deaf coptas swooping overhead firing indiscriminately into the pit. It's not a fair fight. It's not meant to be. It's a circus of carnage, and the humans at the center are the punchline. Prisoners selected for these spectacles are rarely given weapons. If they are, it's part of the joke. A rusted pipe, a stick with a nail, sometimes even a loaded gun with only one bullet. Their opponents vary. Sometimes it's another prisoner, sometimes a feral squig the size of a lemon russ, sometimes a chained orc who's been promised freedom if he makes the crowd laugh. The fights are not always to the death, but survival is no guarantee of reprieve. If the crowd is bored, they'll swarm the arena and kill the victor themselves. If they're entertained, they might demand a second round, with more hazards, more blood, more screaming. There's a ritualistic edge to it. The orcs believe that these gladiatorial games please their gods. Gork, they say, loves the brutality. Mork loves the cunning. Both love a good joke. So the prisoners are encouraged, forced, to perform. You're not just fighting. You're meant to scream, to dance, to flail, to beg in a way that makes the mob erupt in laughter. Some captives, driven beyond sanity, embrace it. They taunt their captors, mock the greenskins, act like clowns in the mud. These ones last the longest, and often their minds don't survive. There's a story told in hushed voices among the black ships of a psyker once captured and thrown into such a pit. He didn't fight back. He stood still, eyes glowing, and whispered a word that made every orc in the crowd stop laughing. Made them weep. For just a moment, they felt his despair. Then they killed him, tearing him apart in a frenzy that left the arena painted in his blood. That tale is told as a warning, not of power, but of what happens when you show the orcs something they don't understand. The arenas also serve another function: population control. Orcs fight each other constantly, but sometimes a war boss decides it's easier to let prisoners do the bleeding for a while. So they throw in a few grots, or even other orcs as opponents, letting the audience bet on who'll die first. Occasionally, an orc joins in just for fun, bashing humans aside with one hand while laughing so hard he forgets to block a lucky blow. A blow that doesn't kill, but amuses enough to keep the human alive another day. There are no champions here, no glory. No crowd of survivors telling your tale. If you win, you might get a piece of bread. If you lose, you die. If you surrender, they might chain you up and throw you in again tomorrow, your wounds barely stitched, your sanity fraying. The fights never end. The crowd never tires, and the laughter never stops. Some prisoners whisper that the worst part isn't the pain. It's the knowledge that this is all you are now. Meat for the pit, a thing that screams and bleeds for the amusement of monsters. And maybe, just maybe, the laughter that echoes through the arena isn't just orcish. Maybe something deeper laughs with them. Something in the warp. Something watching. Something feeding. To fall into the hands of a mech boy is to enter a world of functionless horror. A place where biology is optional, pain is a tool, and purpose is defined by how amusingly loud your suffering can be made. Mechs do not see flesh as sacred, nor even as stable. To them, a human body is merely an inconvenient starting point, a scaffold on which to build something more interesting, more chaotic, more orky. Those prisoners not deemed strong enough for labor or fierce enough for sport may find themselves selected for technical applications. What follows is not death, but transformation into something so divorced from humanity that even the warp might look away. Mech boys are the twisted engineers of the greenskin hordes, minds bursting with mechanical instincts and half-mad inspiration. They are constantly experimenting, tinkering, building, and breaking. And what better way to test a new servo arm or fuel injection nail gun than on a helpless prisoner? Flesh is soft, disposable, and readily available. Many mechs maintain holding pens near their workshops specifically to ensure they have spare parts on hand when inspiration strikes. You are not a test subject. You are a component. The horror begins with the tools. Ork technology is not precise. It is brutal, jagged, and oversized. When a mech decides to affix a saw blade arm to a human prisoner, he does not consider nerves, blood vessels, or pain thresholds. He clamps you down, straps you to a table barely clean of the last subject's remnants, and begins cutting with crude saws and blazing torches. No anesthetic, no planning, just a bellow of, "This'll be good," and a screeching hiss of metal on bone. Limbs are removed without ceremony, sometimes without cause, and replaced with whatever junk the mech has lying around. An exhaust pipe, a buzzsaw, even another creature's appendage if it looks funny. Survival is not the point. If you live, great. If you don't, more parts for the next experiment. But those who do live, if you can call it that, are reshaped in ways that defy reason. A prisoner might be outfitted with wheels for legs, forced to roll across the workshop, fetching tools while their flesh decays around the metal. Others are given tanks of volatile chemicals strapped to their backs, ordered to sprint into the field during a battle to see if the contraption explodes. Mechs might attach mechanical arms with no controls, laughing as the prisoner flails and spins until collapse. One infamous mech is rumored to have built an entire drum line out of human torsos, each one wired to thump against crude skins when prodded with a voltage prod. These are not cyborgs in the imperial sense. There is no standardization, no medical monitoring, no systems integration. These are art projects, ghastly sculptures of suffering made animate by sheer force of orcish will and the prisoner's own stubborn, pathetic biological functions. And worse still, the mech might decide you're a success, that your new form is proper orky, which means you get to keep it, which means you become his assistant, a thing that limps and drools and chirps in binary screams when the mech yells for a wrench. Over time, such prisoners lose the ability to think clearly. The constant pain, the alien mechanisms grafted into their flesh, the humiliation of being paraded as a novelty, it erodes everything. Some develop tics, repeating nonsense words or mimicking orc slang in a desperate attempt to be spared further modification. Others begin to believe they are machines, speaking in mechanical tones or attempting to interface with walls. A few even turn on fellow prisoners, desperate to prove their usefulness and avoid the saws. The ultimate degradation is when a mech takes one of these broken, altered captives and sends them into battle, not as a soldier, as a distraction. A screaming, clanking, oozing mess of flesh and piston, shoved into enemy lines as a joke, a living grenade, a banner of madness waving before the storm. Imperial troops sometimes hesitate at the sight, not out of fear, but confusion. And that moment of hesitation is all the orcs need. In the eyes of the mech, this is creation. This is genius. In the eyes of the Emperor, it is abomination. In the eyes of the prisoner, there is no longer any self left to see. Only rust. Only pain. Only the hiss of the torch and the grin of a green-skinned genius with a new idea. Pain boys are what happens when you give a sadist a license to practice medicine in a society that worships violence. To be captured by one is to descend into a mockery of healing so vile, so fundamentally wrong, that even the most hardened veterans of the Inquisition speak of it with trembling voices. These orcish doctors do not understand anatomy. They do not care about consent. They do not stop when you scream. In fact, that's usually when they start getting creative. Under a pain boy scalpel, the human body is no longer a sacred vessel. It is a canvas of meat, sinew, and opportunity. Pain boys exist at the crossroads of curiosity and cruelty. They are obsessed with flesh, not as a biological mystery, but as something to be chopped, reconfigured, and rearranged into more amusing forms. In orc society, their role is to patch up the wounded with crude tools and sheer force of will. But when they get their hands on a human prisoner, all bets are off. You are not a patient. You are not even an experiment. You are an excuse. The surgical environment is a nightmare. There is no sterility, no clean lighting, no organized table of instruments. The operating room is usually a scrap pile smeared with blood and grease. Instruments range from bone saws to wrenches, welding torches to squig-tooth clamps. You are strapped down with whatever's handy: wires, belts, engine chains. Pain boys work quickly, but not efficiently. They talk to themselves, hum tunelessly, cackle mid-incision. Sometimes they argue with their own reflections in rusted panels. Madness is not a side effect. It is the method. The procedures vary, but all are grotesque. You might wake up with your arms swapped, or your ribs broken and pulled open to make more room. Pain boys love replacing internal organs with mechanical substitutes, not because they function better, but because they make noise. They'll rip out lungs and insert steam pipes so your breathing becomes a wheezing whistle. They'll drill holes in your skull to let the brain breathe, and wire your eyes to flicker like searchlights. One victim was found with a Grotsuka launcher fused into his spine, still alive, screaming between every involuntary shot. There's a hierarchy of suffering among painboy captives. The funny ones, those who squeal in interesting ways or twitch amusingly, get worked on more often. The boring ones are discarded, fed to squigs, or left to rot. But the worst fate is to be declared promising. That means regular sessions, continuous alterations, and the slow, systematic erasure of humanity. Painboys treat these individuals like pets, trophies, even muses. They might keep them in cages in the surgery, injecting them with stimulants at random, whispering secrets into their ears before hammering on their joints with glee. Over time, captives under a painboy's care cease to resemble people. Limbs become twisted things of bone and scrap. Faces sag or freeze in rictus expressions, muscles forever locked by electroshocks. Some lose the ability to speak, their tongues cut or replaced or simply trained into silence. Others are forced to speak only Orcish, their minds reprogrammed by sheer repetition and pain into mimicking their captors. Identity erodes, memory fragments, language collapses. And through it all, the painboy laughs. The Orcs think this is healing. To them, pain is proof of life. Screaming means you're not dead. Movement means you're still worth modifying. A silent patient is a failed project, or worse, one to be dissected and studied in reverse. They might even reanimate the dead with crude electroshock rigs, puppeting the corpses like marionettes for training purposes. Lads, watch his knee go pop when I zap him, writer, is a phrase that has haunted more than one survivor's nightmares. Some who endure these sessions are eventually released, not as an act of mercy, but because the painboy is done with them. They're broken, perfected, boring now. These poor wretches stumble through orc camps, half machine, half mad, babbling and twitching. They are laughed at, kicked, prodded for amusement. Occasionally a mech will pick one up and upgrade it further. But mostly they are left to rot, reminders of what happens when the gods of pain are given tools and time. If a captive ever prays for death, it is during these sessions. Not for the pain, though that is endless, but for the humiliation. The sheer absurdity of your suffering, to be turned into a joke, a toy, a grotesque piece of performance art. The painboy does not hate you. He doesn't even understand you. He just wants to see what happens if he plugs this into that, if he twists this nerve, if he swaps this organ. And the moment you scream, he nods with satisfaction. It's working, he says. This one's working real good. Death, in the grim calculus of the Orcs, is not the end. Not for them, and not for their victims. Among the greenskins, utility rarely expires with life, especially when mechs and painboys are involved. A prisoner might die, yes. Their body might finally give out from the torment, the infection, or the unending labor. But even then, their suffering may not be over. For in the twisted minds of the Orcs, a corpse is not a closure. It is a resource. A canvas. A joke that hasn't finished its punchline. There are countless tales, whispered, suppressed, and often dismissed as heretical hallucinations, of Orcs collecting their dead, human or otherwise, and putting them to further use. It starts innocuously enough. A prisoner dies while building something. The Orcs leave the body in place and simply build around it. The corpse becomes part of the structure, an arm holding a rivet, a spine used as a rebar. But soon, that passive use becomes active. Mechs hook up electrodes. Painboys jam in stimulants and crude bionics. And the dead begin to move. Sometimes this reanimation is purely mechanical. Limbs twitch through simple current loops, heads bob in a mockery of nods. But other times, something more terrible occurs. The Orks don't understand necromancy, but they dabble in its cousin, sheer, brutal, technological defilement. A prisoner's nervous system might still carry enough residual charge for a mech to animate it like a puppet, jerking it into spasmodic dances for orcish amusement. There is even a legend of a pain boy stitching together parts of multiple dead humans to create what he called a Humie squig, a quadrupedal horror that still made whimpering noises when it was kicked. Worse yet is when the Orks try to improve on death. Some corpses are outfitted with crude power sources, wired to servos and pistons. The result is a walking corpse, not quite a servitor, not quite a machine, dragging its own decaying meat through the mud. These constructs are paraded through camps, laughed at, poked, and sent into battle like disposable bombs. One recorded instance from a devastated Imperial outpost describes a reanimated corpse loaded with promethium barrels and hurled toward the walls of a hab block, erupting in fire and shredded flesh upon impact. It was never clear if the corpse was truly dead when it was launched. Even those lucky enough to be incinerated might find no peace. Some Orks collect ashes, mix them with paint or squig slime, and use them to graffiti slogans or mark glyphs on their vehicles. Others keep skulls and femurs as trophies, not out of honor, but because it makes the ride go faster. There's a particularly infamous war boss known only as Big Zog, who claimed to have built his personal banner entirely from the bones of Imperial Guard prisoners, and who ordered his pain boy to lash the remaining pieces into a mock choir, activated by stomping on a pedal that made the skeletons sing. This treatment of the dead is not just a travesty of warfare. It is a desecration of meaning. The Orks don't do it out of hatred. They do it because it's funny, because it breaks the enemy's will, because the sight of your comrade's corpse twitching like a marionette and wearing a Grot's hat is a form of psychological warfare so crude and effective that even hardened commissars hesitate to order a charge. Among inquisitorial circles, there is fear of something darker, that the warp sees this, that the souls of the dead, unable to escape their defiled forms, become trapped, tortured echoes screaming silently inside mockery machines, that these tormented spirits drift, half aware, half lost, feeding nightmares and drawing the attention of darker powers. After all, if the soul is eternal, what happens when its body is kept moving, kept hurting, kept used? Some say that certain chaos cults have begun to mimic these practices, inspired not by daemons but by the Orks, that they view death as a pause, not a stop, that they see the Orks' crude puppetry as a glimpse into a new form of heresy, the enslavement of the soul through technology and mockery. It is not sanctioned sorcery, it is not scientific resurrection, it is something fouler, something blasphemous. So even in death, the prisoners of the Orks are not released. Their bodies are played with, rewired, broken again. Their memory is desecrated. Their comrades must fight through the fields of their twitching remains. And somewhere, a pain boy laughs and says, "This one's still got some kick in him," while hammering another spike through a chest that hasn't breathed in days. There's no funeral here. No last rites. Only rusted cables, the stink of decay, and the relentless hum of a machine made from the corpse of hope itself. The Orks do not speak as men speak. Their language is a riotous mess of guttural snarls, brutal contractions, and violently spat syllables, more felt than heard, more barked than spoken. For a prisoner forced to live among them, the Orkish tongue becomes not just a background noise but a weapon in itself, a constant, inescapable battering of the senses. Over time, it twists its way into the captive's mind, not through understanding, but through repetition, through dominance, through mockery. From the first moment a prisoner regains consciousness in an Ork camp, they are drowned in sound. Orks are not quiet. They do not converse. They shout. They bellow. Every command is barked like an order to the universe. And these commands are not made to be understood. They are made to intimidate, to confuse, to dominate. Get up, Humie. Wag now. Stop to wigglin'. Even when the words can be parsed, their meanings shift, contradict, or collapse into nonsense. You can never be sure if an Ork is demanding your attention or announcing your imminent evisceration. The language barrier is not accidental. It is not just cultural. It is psychological warfare. Orks enjoy being misunderstood. They enjoy the fear, the guessing, the looks of confusion that cross a captive's face as they try to make sense of a world that rejects logic. A grot might tell you to run dare, then don't, and laugh hysterically when you collapse trying to obey. Pain boys might chant nursery rhymes while amputating your limbs, warping the sing-song cadence into something monstrous. Mechs often invent their own dialects entirely, stringing together technical babble that makes no sense even to other orcs, let alone to the humans screaming on their operating slab. But the worst of it is the mockery. Orcs mimic human speech in the way a child might mimic a parent during a tantrum, exaggerated, insulting, and cruel. They'll parrot orders they overheard on the battlefield. El de line, fall back, stand tall, all spoken with squeaky voices and grotesque pantomimes. They mock prayers, twisting sacred litanies into gibberish. Emperor says yous all get shot if you don't die proper. And they do it constantly. You are not just humiliated, you are linguistically unmade. Every word you once knew is now a punchline. Captives quickly find themselves involuntarily absorbing Orcish phrases, not through study but through trauma. A prisoner may find that they start muttering wak when startled, that they refer to food as grub or pain as dakaburn, that they think of the overseer not as the orc, but as de big un. It's not a choice, it's a survival mechanism. When you're screamed at in Orcish every waking moment, your brain adapts, not to understand, but to predict. You begin to recognize tone, volume, body language. You guess what's about to happen and act accordingly. Some captives try to fight it. They cling to Low Gothic, whispering it like a prayer, repeating their name, their rank, their homeworld. But the effort breaks down over time. When every other voice speaks Orcish, when every survival test is delivered in a dialect designed to confuse, you start to forget. Not just vocabulary, syntax, structure, context. Eventually, you begin to dream in Orcish. Nightmares not in images, but in the sound of shouting, metal clanging, and cruel laughter in that awful, barking tongue. There's a term among the Inquisition, linguistic degradation syndrome. It's observed in returned prisoners, especially those held for extended periods. They speak haltingly, they mispronounce basic Gothic terms, they struggle to form complete sentences. Some revert entirely to Orcish slang, especially under stress. There are records of one Astra Militarum sergeant who, after a year in Orc captivity, gave all his field orders in Orcish upon rescue. Not out of loyalty, but because his brain had rewired itself to speak only in threats and violence. The ultimate cruelty of the Orcish tongue is that it offers no path back. There is no translation, no Orc scholar to explain grammar. It is a living thing, evolving second by second, reinforced by volume, not logic. To speak it is to become part of it. And for the prisoner, that means slowly being pulled into the cultural gravity of the WoG, not physically, but cognitively. Language is identity. And when your language is mocked, twisted, and replaced, what is left of the self? For some prisoners, the answer is nothing. They lose their names. They respond to nicknames like Squig Face or No Nose. They forget how to pray. They forget how to curse. All that remains is the bark, the growl, the shouted command, and the reflex to obey. Hope is the most fragile thing a prisoner can carry. In an Orc camp, it is not merely dashed, it is weaponized, transformed into a cruel game of dangling promises and shattered illusions. Physical pain can be endured, madness resisted, even language lost without total collapse. But hope, once given and then ripped away again and again, corrodes the soul like acid. Among all the torments suffered by those taken by the Greenskins, the psychological assault, the orchestration of false chances and fake mercies, is often the one that breaks them for good. It starts small. The first time you're not hit for failing a task. The first time a grot hands you food instead of throwing it on the ground. The first time an orc calls you by something vaguely resembling your name instead of a slur. These moments flicker like stars in the darkness, tiny signs that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare has boundaries. That maybe there is a system, a logic, a way to play the game and survive. But that's the trap, because the moment you start to believe there's a method, they change the rules. One day, a fellow prisoner is taken away and never returns. Whispers start. Maybe they were freed, maybe they escaped, maybe the Orcs respect resilience. And then 2 days later they come back, gagged, mutilated, stitched to a crude signpost that reads, "Too slow." Or worse, they're repurposed into some hideous mock tool, turned into a living lever or flesh-sculpted decoration. The message is clear. You are not ascending. You are being watched for how well you perform your role in the joke. Some orcs encourage this illusion deliberately. There are tales of knobs promising promotion for good behavior. Finish your tasks faster, they say. Fight harder in the pit, make the mechs laugh. And if you do, if you really try, you might be rewarded with a single day without torment. A crust of clean food, a new shirt, even a glimpse of the sky. It feels like progress. It feels like a path out. Until the orc who offered it gets bored and replaces you with someone funnier. Then comes the punishment for getting too hopeful. You're not just beaten, you're laughed at publicly, as if your very belief in escape was the joke. Grots play their own games. They whisper escape routes that lead nowhere. They promise keys to shackles, tools hidden in shadows. They snicker and whisper, "Tonight, run, boss ain't watchin'." And when you do, if you believe them, you find not a tunnel, but a spike pit, or a flamethrower trap. Or worse, a crowd of orcs waiting in ambush, howling with glee at the entertainment. It becomes clear that the grots aren't trying to help you. They're gambling on how spectacularly you'll fail. Some prisoners begin to hallucinate hope. They see lights in the darkness, hear voices calling their names, swear they saw an aquila carved into the rock. They invent rescuers. Some even craft imaginary allies, holding whispered conversations with them in the corners of the pit. These mental constructs become lifelines, and when they fade, when the brain can no longer sustain the illusion, the crash is catastrophic. Some prisoners simply stop moving after that. They lie in the dirt, unresponsive, eyes wide open, waiting for something that never comes. There are also the cruelest tricks of all, the faked rescues. Orcs love mimicry. Some warbands have grots dressed in tattered guard uniforms, leading prisoners out of pens in what appears to be a rescue mission. The weeping gratitude, the stunned relief, it's all part of the setup. Just before the gate, just as freedom seems within reach, the truth is revealed. It was a show, an experiment in human behavior, and those who believe the lie are rewarded not with death, but with a return to the pit, so the others can see what happens when you hope. Even when Imperial forces eventually arrive, if they arrive, the prisoners hesitate. Some scream that it's another trick. Some run away from their rescuers, convinced they're orcs in disguise. Others can't speak at all, their minds too frayed to understand liberation. There are records of liberated camps where the majority of prisoners begged to stay in their cells, not from loyalty but from terror. The routine, the madness, the predictability of abuse, it had become home. Hope is the greatest torment of all, because it never dies quickly, it dies by degrees. And each time it is crushed, the prisoner loses something more than flesh or mind. They lose the ability to believe in anything at all. There comes a point, slowly, insidiously, when some prisoners stop fighting. Not just physically, mentally, spiritually. They begin to mimic their captors, to laugh at the same jokes, to speak in the same barked tones, to shuffle when grots bark orders not out of fear, but reflex. They aren't planning an escape. They aren't playing along. They are breaking. This is the false kinship, a slow transformation not into an orc, but into something worse, a human who has begun to find a kind of twisted place within the wog. This isn't Stockholm Syndrome. This isn't bonding with a captor. It is erosion. It is identity disassembled by repetition. The orcish world is brutally simple, clear roles, loud emotions, no ambiguity. For a prisoner surrounded by insanity, that simplicity becomes seductive. The endless struggle to remain human, to hold on to memories, values, meaning, is exhausting. And so, bit by bit, they let it go. It often begins with language. They drop words like please or thank you. They bark commands at other prisoners. They mock the new arrivals, echoing the way the grots mocked them. It feels like strength, like adaptation, like survival. But then it spreads. They begin to smile when the orcs laugh. They cheer in the pits, even when friends are slaughtered. One day, they push another prisoner down to get a better seat on a rusted bench. One day, they laugh when someone else gets whipped. The orcs notice. They love it. Nothing delights a knob more than a proper funny humie. These corrupted captives are given scraps of privilege, a cleaner cage, a longer leash, sometimes even responsibility. They become overseers, messengers, jesters. The mechs use them as assistants, the pain boys as nurses. It seems like favor, but it's just another layer of mockery. The Orks don't respect these humans. They're amused by them, like squigs that learn to dance. Some prisoners lean into it entirely. They paint their faces with grease. They mimic Orkish chants, slap their chests, try to speak the lingo. They act out mock battles with other prisoners, pretending to be Orks. It starts as performance, but the lines blur. Because pretending to be a monster is easier than living as a victim, and eventually pretending becomes being. These are the prisoners who laugh the loudest, eat first, and sleep best, and they are the most lost of all. The worst part is, it works. These collaborators live longer. They suffer less. They're spared the most brutal deaths. But what remains of them? What identity survives once you've cheered at a friend's execution, once you've begged to be allowed to prove yourself to the boss? And when liberation finally comes, if it comes, these are the prisoners the Imperium doesn't know what to do with. Some fall to their knees, sobbing with realization. Others scream and resist, attacking their rescuers, convinced it's another test. A few simply sit down and cry, not from relief, but because the structure, the clarity, the order of their madness is gone. The Adeptus Ministorum has no rights for the half-lost. The Inquisition views them with suspicion. The Astra Militarum won't take them back. They are too changed, too Orkish in manner and spirit. And so they disappear, into asylums, into penal legions, into silence. Haunted not by what was done to them, but by what they did to themselves in order to survive. And the Orks? They don't care. When their funny Humie is gone, they find another. The wad doesn't miss its toys. It just keeps moving. But somewhere in the heart of a broken mind, a human soul screams into a void it can no longer name. A soul that once sang hymns, once kissed family, once swore oaths, and now knows only how to chant WOG and mean it. Escape from an Ork war camp is not an event. It is a legend. A myth whispered like a ghost story by those still clinging to scraps of self. Because escape, in this place, is not just the act of fleeing, it is the act of becoming something other than a prisoner again. And for most, that becomes impossible long before the physical walls are breached. Physically, an Ork camp is chaos incarnate. Vast, ever-shifting, and patrolled not by sentries but by creatures that revel in hunting. Grots scurry in packs, spying and snitching on every movement. Squigs patrol tunnels with jaws bigger than a man's torso. Orks themselves stomp and brawl without pattern or purpose, but always ready to crush anything that moves too quickly. The environment itself is treacherous. Jagged scrap, open flame, endless smoke. Even the ground can betray you, collapsing into pits or sinking in oily sludge. It is less a prison and more a living, laughing maze. The few who try to flee do so with desperation, not planning. They slip through cracks in the fencing, tunnel under cages, or disguise themselves as grots, smearing filth on their faces, hunching low, muttering nonsense in broken Orkish. Some make it a few dozen meters before being spotted. Most are caught and then paraded. Not just executed, displayed. Strapped to makeshift signs reading, "Running don't work," and left in the sun to rot, sometimes alive. But even if one were to escape the physical perimeter, the trials have just begun. Ork war zones are surrounded by ruin, blasted cities, shattered forests, deserts teeming with predators. There are no supply caches, no maps, no allies. The stars overhead are often blocked by smoke, and the only landmarks are burning wrecks and the laughter that follows you for miles. Escapees are often recaptured not by design but by accident, stumbling back toward the camp without realizing it, driven in circles by madness or terrain. And then there's the internal war, the mental prison. Some who escape physically remain trapped mentally. They move only when barked at. They avoid eye contact. They flinch at shadows. There are accounts of escapees who starve rather than take food uncommanded, who sleep sitting up, waiting for the whip. These are the ones who made it out, but not back. In rare whispered tales, some do survive. Some reach Imperial lines, feral and broken, clawing through the mud to beg for recognition. But even then, safety is no guarantee of salvation. The Inquisition interrogates such survivors thoroughly. Are they corrupted? Have they learned something dangerous? Are they spreading Orkish ideology, even unknowingly? Many are silenced, a few are studied, fewer still are allowed to live free. Those who do escape, body and soul, carry a different burden. They know the taste of madness. They've looked into the eyes of creatures who have no God but war, no joy but suffering, no love but loud noise and pain. They've seen friends turned into jokes, heroes ground into grease, priests made into puppets. And they know, deep in their bones, that some part of them will never truly come back. The final choice then is not whether to escape, it's whether to remember. Some do. They write, they speak, they join the ecclesiarchy or the guard or the Inquisition, and they warn. Others choose silence, they bury the screams. They carve aquillas into their skin and whisper litanies not to pray but to drown the echo of laughter. And a rare few go back, voluntarily. Inquisitorial records list them as infiltration agents, chaos hunters, redemption seekers. But the truth is darker. Some broken minds find clarity in the Orkish way, simplicity, purpose. A world where everything makes sense in its horror. These returnees wear masks, but not for disguise. They wear them because they are no longer sure what face lies beneath. Escape is possible, but it is never clean, never complete, and never without cost. Because the only thing harder than fleeing the Orks is living with what you saw when you did. In the silent spaces where the warp breathes and the veil of reality grows thin, something listens, something feels. And when it gazes upon a soul broken by the Orks, it does not recoil. It hungers. For the suffering endured in those camps, the humiliation, the laughter, the loss of identity, does not vanish when the body dies or the chains are removed. It echoes. And in that echo, the warp finds music. The Orks are not psychically attuned in the way humanity understands. They are a gestalt force of belief and violence. Their crude understanding of the warp filtered through sheer force of will. But their impact on human minds, their warping of human souls, leaves deep, ragged scars that do not fade with time. For every captive who prays and is denied, every whispered plea that goes unanswered, there is a moment when something else hears. Something not the Emperor. The warp is not cruel in the way Orks are cruel. It is reflection, amplification, feedback. And when it sees a soul that has suffered at the hands of creatures who parody reality, who turn faith into jest, heroism into sport, language into noise, it mirrors that madness. There are whispers among the black ships and the librariums of a phenomenon they dare not name. The echo of the Wog in the warp, not from the Orks, but from their victims. Some psychers report dreams where the Emperor speaks in Orkish, where the saints wear rusted armor and scream, "Wah!" as a holy chant. Others weep without knowing why at the sound of laughter. And a few, the rare, the doomed, begin to channel a new kind of madness. Not chaos, not the traditional ruinous powers, but something beyond. A bastard offshoot of despair and mockery, born not of worship, but of survival in the face of cultural annihilation. In these moments, even the Emperor turns his face, not in anger, in sorrow. For the soul that suffers in this way is not corrupted by choice, but by context. It is a person who held on to faith until faith became a joke, who clung to language until every word was spat back as a taunt, who remembered their name until it was erased, then replaced with something shouted by laughing grots. There are inquisitorial reports sealed beneath vaults, speaking of prisoners who return from Ork captivity with impossible auras, not tainted, not clean. Something other, something that warps psychic resonance, who speak in tongues that break Vox recordings, who bleed colors that do not exist. The Orks may not understand the warp, but they generate responses from it, unintentionally crafting instruments of spiritual discord. And so the question emerges, one no scribe dares to write, one no priest dares to ask aloud. What does the warp make of a soul mocked for so long it forgets how to be human? What shape does that echo take? What god, if any, claims such a soul? There are those who say it is Nurgle who delights in broken things. Others claim it is Slanesh who feeds on the absurdity of suffering. But some argue that this is something new, not a chaos god, not an Orkish echo, but a philosophical cancer, a proto-entity of mockery, not worshipped, not summoned, but accumulated through the sheer mass of meaningless pain inflicted across 1,000 war zones. It watches, it waits, it grows. In the end, the fate worse than death is not just captivity. It is not just mutilation or madness or forced mimicry. It is becoming spiritually illegible. It is having your pain so deeply tied to absurdity that no god, no saint, no daemon even knows what to do with you. A soul lost not to darkness, but to ridicule. And that may be the final joke. not told by the Orks, but by the universe itself. A cosmic laughter echoing forever into the warp, built from the screams of those who no longer remember what it meant to speak. There is a silence that follows the scream. A quiet so deep, so total, it feels alive. For those who survive the Orks and crawl free from their grip, this silence is the loudest thing they carry. It's not the silence of peace, but of absence, of a self hollowed out by noise, filled with echoes, and then abandoned. The soul doesn't celebrate freedom, it staggers beneath it. And in this in-between state, this liminal space between torture and salvation, the former prisoner exists not as a person but as a ruin trying to remember what it meant to be whole. They are called survivors, but that word is too clean, too proud. It suggests something linear, suffering, escape, healing. But there is nothing linear about what the Orks leave behind. A man who crawls from a pit after 5 years of forced labor and pit fights is not free. He is released, like a virus breaking out of quarantine, like a ghost pried from a grave. He comes out with hands that tremble at kindness, ears that flinch at laughter, and a voice that speaks only in the pauses between threats. Many of them don't make it far. Not physically, not spiritually. Some collapse in no man's land, too afraid to cross an open field. Others die drinking clean water too quickly, their bodies no longer remembering how to accept purity. Some reach imperial lines and then go silent, not from trauma, but from refusal. They will not speak unless shouted at, will not move unless commanded. These are the ones most often culled quietly by the Inquisition, labeled as Orkish contamination vectors. Their crime is obedience, their sin is learned submission. Those who do survive longer, who are allowed to return, find themselves strangers to the Imperium, its vast machinery, its stern rituals, its cold bureaucracies. After the Orks, even the tyranny of the administratum feels abstract, unbelievable. They sit in debriefing chambers, surrounded by servitors and scribes, and hear their story repeated back in clinical terms. Subject experienced prolonged captivity, subject performed labor, subject witnessed public executions. But they can never explain the joke, the tone, the way the Orks didn't just hurt them, but mocked them, made them complicit, made them laugh when they were supposed to cry. They don't talk about the laughing, or about how they sometimes miss the simplicity. In the pit, you always knew who you were, the broken. In the Imperium, you're expected to rebuild, to resume. But how do you resume a self that was torn apart and stitched back together with engine wire and squig bile? How do you pray when the only sermon you remember is a grot mimicking a preacher while urinating on a skull? Some attempt to reintegrate. They take jobs, marry, even re-enlist, but it's all paper thin. At night they sleep facing doors. They keep objects in their hands at all times, rocks, utensils, keys, because empty hands feel like exposure. Loud noises don't scare them. Silence does. Too much quiet, and the brain fills in the gap with stomping boots and rusted chains and that endless howling walk. There are specialized recovery facilities scattered across Segmentum Obscurus. Few know of them. Fewer return. In these places, priests whisper to them. Medicae monitor their vitals. Scribes try to extract stories, to compile testimonies. But you cannot document absurdity. One man, a former commissar, wept for 3 days because someone offered him food without laughter. Another stabbed himself in the leg every hour on the hour because he had been trained to associate stillness with punishment. And then there are the suicides. Not in the classic sense. These are not acts of despair, these are rejections, acts of defiance against identity. They leap from balconies, not crying but smiling, muttering phrases like, "Now they can't laugh no more." They walk into fire. They stand before bolters and whisper, "Do it, boss." Because part of them still believes this is another test, another joke, that there is no after, only another twist in the performance. The ecclesiarchy has no canon for this. The codexes are silent. The saints offer no parables. What scripture is there for a man who once killed his friend because the Orks told them only one would be fed, and then fed neither? What prayer redeems a soul that willingly barked in Orkish just to avoid being bored? Some try to write their stories. They begin to, at least. The first pages are full of names, places, events. But by the 10th page, things fall apart. The language shifts. The words turn crude, phonetic. Phrases like "Humi chop good" appear in the margins. One former imperial scholar produced a 6-volume memoir, only for the last book to be written entirely in glyphs no one recognized, with illustrations of laughing skulls and twitching limbs. He claimed it wasn't for humans, that it was a joke for the gods. There are moments of clarity, small ones, a flower noticed, a hymn remembered, a child's laugh that doesn't sting. But they are rare, fleeting, like oxygen bubbles rising in toxic sludge. And each one is followed by guilt, because to enjoy something again feels like betrayal, like joining the orcs in the final mockery, the idea that life after them is even possible. And yet, some fight through it, not with therapy, not with litanies, but with rage, pure, refined fury. They join the Inquisition, the Sisters Repentia, the Death Watch auxiliaries. They turn their trauma into weaponry, their memories into blades. They do not recover, they burn, they wear the scars as sigils. And every orc they slay is one less joke in the universe. But even these warriors whisper, in their sleep, in tongues no one should understand. They mumble punchlines to jokes no one told, and they wake laughing. Not because it's funny, because it's the only sound they remember how to make. If you've stayed with this descent into horror, thank you. Subscribe to the channel for more lore, theories, and explorations of the darkest corners of Warhammer 40k. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, some prisons don't need bars. They just need you to laugh.